Now, you know, I've been going to these UFO conferences forever. I speak at all of them all over the world. Everywhere we go, they always say, when is the government going to release their files? Because we all know the government know UFOs are real. They know a lot more about them, but they're always saying, no, 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 there's nothing there. And the big question is, when are they going to open their files and let us know it's real? Today, we're going to have the answer. They are being released. Not America. I said America's the Johnny-come-lately. But Nick Pope will tell you about all the other countries and what they are releasing. And you know, I think with the pressure on like that, America's going to finally have to say, well, yeah, maybe. Okay. Well, Nick Pope used to work for the Department of Defense in the UK, in England. You were there for quite a while. And he ran the British government's UFO project in England, so they did have a project. And he's been traveling all over. I saw him on CNN, it wasn't too many months ago, where Canada was releasing their files on the UFOs. And I said, that's Nick Pope. He was in there where they were talking about them. So I said, you're right on top of all this. You know what's being released. And you said you also know what they're sitting on. They won't release. But this is the answer to the question everybody always wants to know. When is it going to happen? And we know they've known about it since the beginning, but it's finally coming out. They can't keep hiding it anymore. You're also an author. He's written several books. And now it says you're the deputy director of the Directory of Defense Security. In what country?
No, that was my last one.
Your last one, okay. All right, but he's going to be talking about what the governments are doing with their information. Okay, Nick Pope.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Dolores. And
I hope I got it correct.
yes, absolutely. I would like to thank, first of all, Dolores and the entire organizing committee for their kindness and their hospitality and their organizational skills in putting on what I think you'll all agree is a very well-attended and well-organized conference. So thank you. Thank you also to the AV team back there, who I know are working so incredibly hard that they've only just got lunch and they haven't had time to eat it. So thanks to you guys too. This is actually my second time at this particular conference. I think I was here last in about 2008, 2009, and I have a very odd recollection of coming here in that I posted on my Facebook wall, I've just arrived here in the beautiful town of Eureka Springs. And because Eureka Springs has quite an alternative community, and because Facebook does targeted adverts, next thing, what I see on my wall is, would you like to come on a gay cruise? For those of you that don't know, although my background is in the UK and I worked for the Ministry of Defense for 21 years, 3 years of which were on their UFO project, I now actually live in America. I spend my time between San Jose, California and Tucson, Arizona, so it's good to be here. Thanks for having me. For some reason, they approved my green card, so I guess I'm not doing something too bad. So, okay, what I'm going to do today is two things. Firstly, as Dolores said, I'm going to perhaps tell the wider story of some of the disclosure of information relating to UFOs that has gone on all around the world over the last few years, with a particular reference, of course, on the UK's position as it relates to files and documents that not only was I privy to, but in many cases that I actually wrote. So it's something of a blast from the past to see some of this material released. What I then want to go on to do in the second half of the presentation, which was not advertised, but is talk a little bit about the UK's best-known UFO incident, the Rendlesham Forest case from December 1980. And the reason I'm going to talk about that is that I have just co-authored a book on the subject, which is coming out next Tuesday. I do not even have my own author copies yet, but by special negotiation with the publishers, the organizers here have managed to acquire some copies which are downstairs. So I don't know how, they're clever, very clever. So I will, after this presentation, go down to the Ozark Mountain vendor's table and I'll have a look at my own book for the first time. But if any of you would like to buy one, I will of course be happy to sign it. So we'll do a little bit about Rendlesham in the second half. But as Dolores said in her introduction, the, I guess, bread and butter of this presentation is going to be the declassification and release of a vast amount of UFO information from many, many different countries all around the world. Dolores mentioned Canada. Many of you may have seen in a number of mainstream media shows the former Canadian Defense Minister, the Secretary of State for Defense, and indeed the former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, the Honourable Paul Hellyer, talking quite openly about this subject and talking about the reality of this phenomenon. And for somebody, I think, if we can, I don't know, wind back the clock 10 years and say, do you think we'll ever get to a stage where a former defense secretary will be talking quite openly about the reality of this? I think the answer might have been no. Well, ladies and gentlemen, now that's exactly what's happening. And I think the door is open a crack, and one more push, and who knows where we'll end up. So I think this is an exciting time. And all around the world, governments are releasing information on UFOs and dumping it into the public domain. Canada, Australia, Norway, Denmark, Italy, Brazil, the United Kingdom, certainly. Any big countries there that you didn't hear me mention? No pressure. China, yes. China. And I think this is one of the other great things about the internet, which is indisputably one of the factors that has changed the subject of ufology irrevocably over the last couple of decades, is the rise of the internet and the fact that now for the first time, though the English language issue is still a problem, but with various translation programs and things, we are perhaps better able than we ever were to appreciate that this isn't some peculiarly American phenomenon. It is not something confined to America, the UK, and the English-speaking world. This is truly a global phenomenon. And in fact, the whole point that we're now getting material from Russia, from China, from South America, out into the public domain. And I think in all these different countries, people are coming to realize that, hey, wait a minute, you know, I thought it was just us. We had these weird reports, but no, it's everyone. And I think, I hate to lapse into cliches like the global village and such like, but I think that when we do realize that we're not alone with these experiences, we're not alone with these beliefs, when we can actually reach out and see that people all around the world from different nationalities, cultures, religions, political belief, all have this common thread of interest in this subject, belief in it, and in many cases direct experience. And I think we realize that there is a global community here, and that community, that global community, is increasingly coming together through the means of the internet. The other point about the internet that I would make is that with the rise of sites such as WikiLeaks, with characters like Julian Assange, Bradley/Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, we see that there are people, whatever our beliefs are on the rights and wrongs of leaking classified material or whistleblowing, whatever our beliefs are about that, it's a fact of the modern day world that it is now easy to just quickly dump into the public domain vast amounts of information. And I think that holds out the intriguing possibility that if there is, as many believe, a smoking gun out there, it is perhaps only a matter of time before someone, whether they have authorized or unauthorized access to it, but someone in government or in the world of defense contractors says, hey, wow, look at this. Everyone has a right to know. Press send to everyone. So if the information is out there, this new environment in which we live is a very receptive one. And I think we may have exciting times ahead. With those speculative remarks out of the way, I'm just going to perhaps rewind and tell the more specific story of the release of the British government's UFO files. What's in them, why they were released, what the public and media reaction was, and what the wider consequences of this might be. And to tell that story, I guess I have to wind the clock back to around about, well, let's say 1997, and the election of Tony Blair's Labour Party government after many years in opposition. And one of Tony Blair's flagship election promises, which interestingly he later said was his biggest regret, but one of his flagship promises was that he would introduce a Freedom of Information Act in the United Kingdom. We didn't have one. The UK's Freedom of Information Act was passed in 2000, and because of the complexities in rolling it out across all aspects of government and public bodies, it was actually January 1st, 2005, before it came fully into force. Now, one of the exercises that government departments had to do in that period between 2000, when the Act was passed, and 2005, when it came fully into force, was to really prepare for it, to train staff in how to respond to FOI requests, and to try to make some estimate of what subject people would be asking about. So, self-evidently, when it came to the Ministry of Defence, the service chiefs and the senior civilian staff sat around and they said, well, it's obvious that one of the top queries is going to be Iraq, and it's obvious that some of the other things that people will ask are more historical questions about what their father or grandfather did in the war, that sort of stuff. When the Freedom of Information Act came into force, the Ministry of Defence, in common with all government departments, started producing league tables showing what people were asking about. Guess what subject the MOD got more requests about than any other subject? UFOs. They did not know what hit them. And the workload in dealing with this was phenomenal. And although some people criticize the Freedom of Information Act and say that, well, actually, there are so many exemptions covering the more sensitive areas such as defense, national security, intelligence. So although the FOI has its critics, journalists and well-informed members of the public can and do exploit it very cleverly to actually create huge amounts of work for the government and get us jumping through all sorts of hoops. That's good. You know, there's a website in the UK called They Work For You, and I think and I think we'd all do well to bear that in mind. So the Ministry of Defence, in drawing up its league tables, found to its shock and horror that they were getting more FOI requests on UFOs than anything else. What to do? Every time you had to respond to one of these requests, the clock was ticking, and the Information Commissioner, who polices the application of the Freedom of Information Act across government, would come down on departments like a ton of bricks if they started missing their FOI targets. And it is a legal it's a legal prerequisite. You can cite an exemption and refuse to respond, but you can't just ignore it or leave it in your in tray. So unexpectedly, in 2005, and over the next couple of years, the Ministry of Defence found that staff were being tied up with an incredible amount of work on UFOs, this subject which, supposedly, was only of very limited interest. Well, for a subject of limited interest, it turned out that there were an awful lot of documents out there, and we'll come on to that later. So 2005, 2006, the MOD was dragged into all these FOI requests. In 2007, the French government decided to declassify and release their entire archive of files. They announced to the world's media that they would do this, and they would put it on a dedicated website. And on the day in question, in 2007, when the website went live, so many hundreds of thousands of people from all around the world logged on that the whole website crashed, and there was huge embarrassment and red faces throughout the government in France. But the interesting point about that was not so much that the French didn't have very good servers, but was more to the fact that a modern democracy, an open, free democratic country, which many people say is in many ways similar to the United Kingdom, had just done what we had really said that we wouldn't do. Dumped the whole lot of UFO files into the public domain. And this created a precedent which, as the media pointed out, then became difficult for the British government to ignore. Because the point was this: the media would say, well, hold on, Ministry of Defence. If you say that this subject is of very little defence interest, and that we haven't really got much on this, and if the French government have released their files, what have you got? Why can't you do the same? So, for those two reasons, in 2007, the British government made a policy decision, which was approved by the Secretary of State for Defence, to release the entire archive. Unlike the French government, this could not be done in one go. There was too much material. It transpired that this subject, which for years and years and years, we in the Ministry of Defence had been routinely telling the British Parliament, the media and the public, was of limited defence significance. When we actually counted up, we found that we had 55,000 pages of documents, some of which were classified secret UK eyes only. Oops. So much for a subject of little defense interest. Needless to say, we could not dump that into the public domain all at once. Just the workload in redacting the information, blacking out, for example, even quite innocuous things like names and addresses of witnesses to fulfill the personal data, personal privacy rules. Even that would take months and months, if not years. And indeed, that's how it turned out. The first bunch of these files, they were batched up into 10 groups, as it turned out. And the first batch of files was released on May the 8th, 2008. And the final batch was released on June 21st last year. So as you can see, for a subject that we'd said was of very limited interest, it turned into a 5-year program to declassify and release all this information. And indeed, it did make international news. And I was involved in many interviews to try to promote that story, and everything from, gosh, I did quite a lot of your shows actually over here. I did, what did I do? Joy Behar, I think, Geraldo at Large, Good Morning America, Nightline. So some fairly mainstream shows with things like Good Morning America. I mean, this was a big media story, and I think it just goes to show the level of interest in all of this. Now, obviously that then had a knock-on effect with some of these other countries. And again, as Dolores said in her introduction, what you actually have is this British project to release this information, kind of playing into a wider global network, if I can call it that, of disclosure. Not necessarily with countries consulting each other about this, but almost like a line of dominoes falling one by one. As one country discloses its UFO files, the pressure mounts on those countries that have not yet done so. And the spotlight turns on them, and the media say, okay, we've kind of bought into this thing that it's not really an issue. But if that's true, let's see the files. You know, the Brits have done it, the French have done it, Brazil, China, Russia, Australia, Norway. So it's just a question now, I think, of zooming in on the handful of countries that have not yet disclosed and asking, what is it that you've got? And if there's something that you can't release, why? Given that this subject is consistently portrayed as being some sort of unclassified, nutty subject. And yet, from all the countries whose files have been disclosed, we find that's not the case at all. All the time, the Ministry of Defence was telling Parliament, the media, and the public that this was of no interest. Behind the scenes, as we now can see in these files, highly classified intelligence studies, for example, were going on. And I'm going to come on to a little bit of that later. Let me just dip into some of the files. I mean, the material that's released, like I say, about 55,000 pages of documents. And, you know, there's an old saying, the best place to hide a book is in a library. Best place to hide a tree is in a forest. There are some pretty incredible things in those files, but when you dump 55,000 pages of UFO documents into the public domain, unless you helpfully tell the media, hey, this is a good story, the media just kind of tend to just dip in and pick some kind of fun, silly stories. And we certainly did see some fun and silly stories. One of my favorites was the man who put on a bet at odds of 100 to 1 that by the end of the 20th century there would be indisputable proof of an extraterrestrial reality. And he wrote to us at the Ministry of Defense and said, come on, I'm really going to clean up on this. If you just disclose, I'm going to be rich. How about it? Some of the more disturbing cases in the files were a whole series of near misses between UFOs and commercial aircraft. And whatever you believe about UFOs, I think we could all accept that there are serious defense, national security, and air safety issues involved in a phenomenon when, for example, you can go to both the Ministry of Defense files and the Civil Aviation Authority, which is the UK's equivalent of your FAA, and see case after case documenting not passengers seeing things out of their windows, but the pilots actually seeing and then reporting these things. 3 cases actually came out just in the last year or so over the UK. There are many more, of course, all around the world. But in one of these cases, the pilot saw something heading towards the aircraft, and he had time to shout, "Look out, look out," and brace for impact before this delta-shaped craft just passed very rapidly down one side of the aircraft. In another case, the first officer was about to take violent evasive action to avoid a collision. Evasive action which itself might have brought down the plane. And he said the only reason, looking back, that he didn't do that was that the UFO was so fast it was gone before he could react. And pilots, I think you'll agree, generally have pretty quick reactions. These are the sorts of cases that one just finds casually leafing through these files. And again, I think this illustrates to me the seriousness of this phenomenon and the incredible information which is already out there. But like I say, it's almost a question of information overload. If you say to a journalist, if a journalist challenges you as someone with an interest in UFOs and says, "Oh, come on, I've seen a few hoax documents. Is there any good stuff out there?" You might say, "Yes, look at the British Ministry of Defense." But what journalist is going to have time to go through 50,000 pages of documents? Probably not many. And yet there is some good stuff there. Let me read you a couple of things. Oh, first of all, this is, I think, quite an interesting one about the way in which sometimes interesting things can be hidden in plain sight. I'm going to read you something that appeared on the Ministry of Defense website in around about 2007, 2008. And have in your minds, well, the Ministry of Defense, maybe they're talking about surveillance cameras or something like that. Here's what it said. A study was undertaken in 2001 to 2002 to investigate theories about capabilities to gather information remotely about what people may be seeing and to determine the potential value, if anything, of such theories to defense. As it turned out, this rather innocuous, low-key announcement that some journalist skimming through might have thought related to some surveillance camera, in fact related to a study to see whether the MOD could recruit psychics to track down Osama bin Laden. I'll read it again now that you know what it's about. Have another listen to it and listen to it with fresh ears, and you'll see what I mean. A study was undertaken in 2001 to 2002 to investigate theories about capabilities to gather information remotely about what people may be seeing and to determine the potential value, if any, of such theories to defense. A secret now declassified government study into remote viewing. And there it was, released onto the MOD's website, and yet, unless you knew how to look for these things, it wasn't exactly publicized, was it? Note the very clever way that the term ESP, or psychic, or clairvoyant, does not once appear in this statement. So, I think sometimes just knowing the way in which governments like to play these games and hide things in plain sight is quite interesting. Let me read something else. And here's a question for you. And by the way, in this, the phrase UAP means unidentified aerial phenomena. So when I say UAP, just think UFO. And I'm going to read a statement, and I want you to think whether this statement was written by the Mutual UFO Network or by the British UFO Research Association. That UAP exist is indisputable. Credited with the ability to hover, land, take off, accelerate to exceptional velocities and vanish, they can reportedly alter their direction of flight suddenly and clearly can exhibit aerodynamic characteristics well beyond those of known aircraft or missiles, either manned or unmanned. Mufon or Bufora? Okay, the answer is neither. British Ministry of Defence. Isn't that a phenomenal statement for the Ministry of Defence to have made? And yet, that is precisely the statement that was made in one of the key documents ever to have been released under the Freedom of Information Act. A highly classified study, again at Secret UKIA, just one down from top secret, carried out by the Defence Intelligence Staff, a ultra-secretive part of the MOD, and which resulted in a 468-page final report, of which only, I believe, 9 copies were ever made. And then, because of the Freedom of Information Act, it had to be dumped into the public domain. But again, extraordinary statements like that were either missed by the media or avoided. Now, whether the mainstream media just simply didn't spot statements like that, because as we've seen with the remote viewing study, the Ministry of Defence doesn't exactly help journalists find their way to the meaty parts of a story. But, you know, whether it's a case of the mainstream media missing this, or for some reason choosing not to cover it, is perhaps a wider debate to be had. But this 468-page report, which was codenamed, the study was codenamed Project Condign. The technical study name, again, probably to make it less noticeable for search engines on the internet, was UAP in the UK ADR. Unidentified aerial phenomena in the United Kingdom Air Defence Region. There it is, hidden on plain sight. You can probably find it tonight in your hotel rooms on the internet. It's, you know, I'm not a whistleblower here. I'm not about to get carted off. All this has been declassified and released, and you can see it on the National Archives website and the Ministry of Defence website. None of this is disputed. This isn't like, for example, MJ12 documents where half of the UFO community believe in them and half say they're hoaxes. This is actually documents, the provenance of which is not disputed, and they're actually put out by the government on the government's own website. That UAP exist is indisputable. There you are. Some people ask, when will disclosure come? I would say, does that statement not fit the bill, potentially? Maybe a very controversial figure in this whole subject is John Alexander, who's a former US Army colonel who often speaks at UFO conferences. And he takes the view that disclosure has happened, but nobody noticed. Or rather, nobody in the mainstream media. We all noticed, but that's because we're smart. Let me read you a couple more quotes from the now declassified final report of Project Condign. And again, bear in mind that UAP effectively is just our way of saying UFO, because when we were looking for funds to get this study commissioned, we felt, probably rightly, that the Secretary of State and other politicians wouldn't feel comfortable signing off on a UFO study. So we just said, oh, yeah, UAP, yeah, scientific stuff. Okay, I'll sign. So anyway, there was a little bit about flight safety. And again, for anyone that thinks that government doesn't itself say some pretty interesting things about UFOs, if only you know where to look, this was from the Project Condign section dealing with the flight safety implications of UFOs. And there was a recommendation. No attempt should be made to outmaneuver a UAP during interception. This is from a subject which apparently is of no defense interest. There was an explanatory note which perhaps put a bit more context on that one, and it said this: at higher altitudes, although UAP appear to be benign to civil air traffic, pilots should be advised not to maneuver other than to place the object astern, if possible. Do not mess with these things. So why the interest? Why the secrecy? If this subject really is just no defense significance, the reason I say so often no defense significance is that is the British government's soundbite on UFOs. Either no defense significance or no defense interest. It's a glib little soundbite that dismisses the whole subject in a short sentence. And yet, as we've seen with some of the material from Project Condign, it is perhaps at odds with the reality. But why? Why the secrecy? Again, there were some clues if you really drilled down into some of the... I mean, Project Condign was... When they put it out, they didn't even put it out as one searchable PDF document. It was put down in dozens of different parts with supporting papers and volumes, and it was very, very difficult to keep track. But if you looked carefully, the answers to these questions about why the secrecy, why the interest, they were there. Those answers were there. And they are not answers which maybe those of you who take a more spiritual and New Age answer view of this will like. But I'll tell you what the study said anyway. Again, this is a direct quote from Project Condign. There is evidence that scientists in the former Soviet Union have taken a particular interest in UFO phenomena. They have identified the close connection with plasma technologies and are pursuing related techniques for potential military purposes. For example, RF weapons, impulse radars, air vehicle drag and radar signature reduction or control, and possibly for radar reflecting decoys. RF weapons? This is from the MOD's own study. What? They're making a death ray out of this technology? But that's what it says. Like I say, you can read this document in the comfort of your hotel rooms this evening. It went on to say, the relevance of plasma and magnetic fields to UAP was an unexpected feature of this study. it is recommended that further investigation should be undertaken into the applicability of various characteristics in various novel military applications. I think an awful lot is implied in that phrase, novel military applications. And a lot of the reasons about why government, the military, the intelligence agencies, and aerospace and weapons companies all around the world are interested in this subject has to do with that phrase, novel military applications. So, I think those quotes kind of give you a sense of the sorts of documents that turned up when the British government released all this material. And here was something else which I thought was quite interesting. Again, talking about plasma fields and things. This was a very technical, scientific report. And there was a lot of consideration about the interaction of the UAP phenomenon with people. And there was one little giveaway phrase which I think is very significant, and it said, "The close proximity of plasma-related fields can adversely affect a vehicle or person." And it went on to talk about behavior modification, effect of EM fields and plasma fields on the temporal lobes in the brain, and it took no real view. This was the clever thing about this study. It took no real view on what UFOs actually were, but it said whatever they are, they're real, and they affect people and they affect vehicles. So all these things that we see in sci-fi movies about car engines cutting out, all these experiences that people report are real, and the government, or at least the British government, has agreed. So I think that's a good thing. Because I think, in a sense, what it does to people that think they're alone with these experiences, whether they are UFO encounters, abduction experiences, or perhaps other anomalous experiences that don't neatly fit into pigeonholes, and I think there are an awful lot of those experiences out there. I think it gives those people, or should give those people, comfort that there are people, even in government, who are prepared to say, you know what, you're not crazy, this is real, we don't know what it is, but we should study it more. You probably wouldn't agree for novel military application, but hey, at least it's something that the government is saying that you're not crazy. Few cases perhaps illustrate the coming of all of this together better than the Rendlesham Forest incident, and now I'm going to shift gear and perhaps talk about that. But before I leave Project Condign, maybe slightly getting ahead of myself, but I wanted to read one quote from Project Condign about Rendlesham, because again, I think the media missed the fact that somewhere in those 460 pages there was a pretty startling admission that Britain's best-known UFO case was real. Project Condign said this: "The well-reported Rendlesham Forest / Bentwaters event is an example where it might be postulated that several observers were probably exposed to UAP radiation for longer than normal UAP sighting periods." So, isn't that odd that the American government's public position is that UFOs haven't been investigated since 1969 when Project Blue Book was axed, and therefore there's no real public position taken on Rendlesham Forest, even though it involved United States Air Force military personnel, as I'll go on to say. And yet it took the British government to say, hey, these people were irradiated by a UFO. And I think it's my hope that this will enable those people caught up in the Rendlesham Forest incident to perhaps get some sort of closure on this case, and to take forward their own struggles, which I'm going to come on to obtain some of the military records relating to their experiences, and particularly some of their medical records, which may have a bearing on current healthcare issues. So with that last quote from Project Condign, I'm now going to move to Rendlesham Forest. And I know there are many of you in here who have been coming regularly to this conference, and many of you will have seen TV shows on the Rendlesham Forest incident. But I know that there are always a number of people who are here for the first time. So I think it would be unfair not to at least set the scene with a very brief and general telling of what happened. So this is, and I regard the Rendlesham Forest incident, and I've been a little bit outspoken on this in past months, and it's not, I promise, because I've got a book out on the subject. I've been a little bit outspoken about Roswell of late, and I've suggested that if we haven't solved Roswell by now, we're probably not going to solve it. And I've also suggested, which has been controversial, because of course it's not for me to say what the UFO community should or shouldn't do. I mean, that's your own decision. It's not for me to say. But I can't help but wonder whether it does ufology any favors when the flagship case that is consistently put forward as the best evidence happened nearly 70 years ago, and just about most, if not all, of the primary witnesses are dead. I think that sort of thing is a bit of a gift to the skeptics and the media who want to disparage this. And I think that if ufology collectively says, hey, this is our best case and it's 70 years ago, a lot of people might say, well, you know what, don't you have anything better? So with that in mind, I have been a little bit outspoken. I mean no disrespect to the Roswell witnesses, and I certainly mean no disrespect to the Roswell researchers. And indeed, I had this conversation with the late Jesse Marcel Jr. Just shortly before he died last year. And I said to him, look, Jesse, I hope you don't mind that I'm making these points. And he, consummate gentleman that he was, said he quite understood my point. So nonetheless, I think that Rendlesham Forest might be a stronger case, and that therefore when skeptics or journalists challenge the UFO community to bring forward your best evidence, I would certainly say that Rendlesham Forest should be up the top, if not at the very top. And I regard it as almost the perfect storm of a UFO case. Almost every single factor that you could think of that would make a UFO case compelling is present in this one incident. Military witnesses, check. Multiple witness event, check. Sightings over not just one night, but a series of 3 nights, check. UFO tracked on radar, check. Physical evidence, check. Senior military personnel prepared to talk on the record about this, check. Audit trail of verifiable government documents proving that this is real and validating some of the most compelling points in the whole narrative, check. All those cases, all those factors were present. So just briefly to tell the story, early hours of December 26th, 1980, the twin bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge lie in the county of Suffolk in England, but they are, to all intents and purposes, United States Air Force bases. And because the two establishments, Bentwaters and Woodbridge, are so close together, really just a few hundred yards, they are treated for command purposes as a single entity. There is one wing commander there, and they are referred to as the twin bases. Military guard personnel on patrol see a strange light in the forest, and their first thought was that an aircraft had crashed. Not a military aircraft. They knew there was no military flying that night, but they thought that maybe a civilian aircraft had come down, maybe a light aircraft or something, and started a fire. But the lights looked odd, and as the patrol went out into the forest, they were uneasy, and indeed one of them made a throwaway remark which unnerved everyone when he said, "It didn't crash, it landed." The lights were all different colors and seemed to be moving around. The two main people, and one of the other things that happened, by the way, was that they drove out in their Jeep through the east gate. They got to a part of the forest and they went down a track, but the track soon became so narrow that they had to get out of the vehicle and proceed on foot. They went a few hundred yards, and by this time it was clear to them, whatever this thing is up ahead, it's not an aircraft, but we don't know what else it could be, so I guess we'll just have to go through. And there were originally 4 or 5 people out there, but their radios started to malfunction. Remember earlier, the quote about interference with vehicles and with people. Well, the radios were cutting out. So what they did is they kept having to leave people, one at the vehicle, one kind of halfway between the vehicle and the next point, so that they could set up a radio relay. The two guys who got to go forward were John Burroughs and Jim Penniston. Now, I think a few years ago, if you'd seen a documentary about the Rendlesham Forest incident, the character that you probably saw more of than anyone else was probably Charles Holt, and we'll come on to him. But now, I think quite rightly, there's been a whole recent bunch of new TV documentaries on this subject that have put John Burroughs and Jim Penniston back where I always thought they should be, which is center stage when it comes to this incident, because they were the people who first encountered this UFO on the first night. And they got to a small clearing in the trees, and what they found there was not a crashed aircraft, but a landed UFO. This is not some lights in the sky case. This is a structured craft that had landed. And they said this thing was about 9 feet across, 9 feet tall, roughly triangular shaped, but looking a little bit like maybe some sort of lunar landing module or something rather more like a high-tech sci-fi version of one of our lunar landing modules, something like that. There were strange hieroglyphic symbols on the side. I mean, Jim Penniston said that he thought these were like Egyptian hieroglyphs, and yet they were subtly different. Lots of photographs were taken, but subsequently everyone on any of the nights of activity that took photos and handed those photos into the base processing laboratory was told afterwards, "I'm sorry, your photos didn't come out." Maybe that was because the UFO was so bright that it just didn't come out. Maybe radiation from the craft, and I'll get onto that, fogged the film. Or maybe, as some people allege, maybe that's not entirely correct. But Jim Penniston had the presence of mind, after he'd taken his photos, to sketch this in his police notebook. And his version, there are two versions of this. There's the I'm out in the middle of the forest with a UFO, so my hand is shaking so much this is pretty rubbish drawing version. And there's the I'm sitting back in my office and I'm now going to try and draw it properly now I've stopped shaking version. But they're both out there and you can see them, and there's no middle ground with this. I think with a lot of UFO sightings, with a lot of these vague lights and shapes in the sky, you can say, well, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. With a case like Rendlesham Forest, United States Air Force personnel on duty encountering a landed craft, there's no middle ground here. You know, it either is or it isn't. So Jim touches the side of this thing. Big mistake, probably. Incidentally, looking back on this now, I don't know how many of you in the audience have had your own sightings or experiences, but one thing I've noticed about skeptics is that they sometimes say, hey, you know what, these people are falling over themselves to get on TV and to be personalities. One thing I've probably heard Jim and John and a heck of a lot of other people say more than anything else is, if I could put the clock back and have this not have happened to me, I would do that. Now, maybe some people take a different experience, view on that, and interpret experiences in a more spiritual, New Age way, and maybe some don't. Maybe we're dealing with different phenomena, or maybe we're simply dealing with different ways of reacting to a phenomena. But for whatever reason, suffice to say that Jim and John wish this hadn't have happened to them. Jim touched the side of the craft, and it's like suddenly there was this humming. It's like the way he put it to me was that he felt that he activated something. This UFO had been sitting on the ground, and once he touched it, it rose slowly up, incredibly bright. You had to shield your eyes to look at this thing. It slowly maneuvered its way through the trees. This was a very small clearing. It was clear to them that when this thing had come down in the first place, though they didn't see that, it had smashed some of the branches off the trees. So again, there was physical trace evidence backing up the presence of this. Again, the thing maneuvered slowly through the small gap in the canopy of the trees, and once it had cleared the treetops, it accelerated away at incredible speed, having previously moved very, very slowly. And Jim just wrote in his police notebook, speed impossible. And Jim, one of Jim's skill sets as a senior sergeant with the military police and things was aircraft recognition. And I mean, he said, suffice to say, this was like no aircraft or helicopter or drone that I've ever seen at the time or indeed since. And bear in mind, the technology is now 30 years on. So he said this was just like nothing on earth that I've seen before. When Jim and John got back to the patrol, the people that had been left back with the vehicles, they were in a state of absolute panic because it transpired that they'd lost contact with Jim and John completely. And to have military personnel missing in the middle of what was being treated as a security incident is needless to say a pretty serious situation. And suffice to say that when they actually got back to base, they found that a patrol was on the point of being sent out to look for them. And also, when they got back, it seemed that there was a discrepancy between the time on their watches and everyone else's watches. So again, had something happened there to them of which they had no conscious recollection, or had something happened, as some speculate, with time itself in relation to this. But for some reason there was a missing 45 minutes. And of course in the military everything is absolutely documented down to the minute. So again, this was an intriguing aspect of this case. There's a kind of often overlooked middle night, a second night of activity. It's an interesting thing with Rendlesham. A lot of people talk about the first night, and what it turns out is the third night. Few people mention or even aware of the second night of activity, which I won't go into too much depth on, but one of the incidents involved a ball of light passing through the open window of one of the military vehicles and out of the other open window, and so freaking out one of the personnel on duty that they had to be removed from active duty for a while and returned to base because this whole incident was just too much to handle. And you know, looking at some of the witness testimony like that, it's easy to forget that the Rendlesham Forest incident isn't just the couple of clips that you've seen maybe on TV, but are other incidents like this ball of light passing through the cab of the military vehicle. And you know, military personnel don't tend to spook that easily. So, but I don't know how I would react if I had a ball of light go through like that. I think I would be pretty shaken up too. So maybe I can understand that. But the other night of activity that is often reported on is Colonel Holt's night, the third night. And there was an awards ceremony going on. And a lot of the senior staff were there presenting awards. And suddenly, one of the duty personnel came up to Colonel Holt, saluted, and said, "Sir, it's back." And Holt looked a bit confused. He said, "What are you talking about?" "What, the UFO, sir. The UFO's come back." Well, Holt was not a believer in this. And Holt had heard the story of some, but not all, of the previous encounters that had happened over the last 2 nights. But Holt regarded this, he was the deputy base commander, a lieutenant colonel, so one of the most senior military officers at the twin bases. And he regarded this whole thing as an unnecessary and unwelcome distraction. And he wanted to put this whole matter to rest. And he said, "Right, I'm going to throw together a small team, go out into the forest, and it's time to debunk this UFO nonsense for once and for all." As you will go on to hear, that didn't exactly turn out that way. So Holt's first view was, let's throw as much light onto the forest as we can. If there's something in there, we're going to flush it out. And one of the things that they have in the United States Air Force are these kind of, they're called light-alls. They are basically floodlights mounted on low trailers. And you can drag them or drive them out into the forest. And Holt said, let's get a whole bunch of light-alls, drag them into the forest. If there's something in there, we'll find it. So he gets all these light-alls, and yet, and by the way, somebody I interviewed who was at the motor pool that night said that he had never seen in his entire career such a state of panic and so many people all wanting to fuel up Lightalls at once. And he said, for anyone who tries to suggest this was just a low-key inquiry, he said, I tell you what, half the duty personnel were out there. Whether they were all out officially or whether there were some kind of unofficial sightseers, so to speak, is open to debate. And certainly rumors about the UFO had circulated around the Twin Base over the last couple of days. So when word came out that the UFO had returned, it doesn't surprise me that a lot of people, as a private enterprise, wanted to get out there and see it. But suffice to say, the motor pool it looked like the biggest NATO exercise you could imagine, he said, with all these Lightalls queuing up to be fueled, all the personnel running around. And they got the Lightalls out, and guess what happened? They all started to malfunction. And the lights dimmed and went off, and the engine spluttered and died as people tried to kind of take these things out. And Holt was furious. He said, get this sorted out. This is crazy. Get new ones. Take these defective ones back and get new ones. And he thought, okay, there's a UFO out there somewhere, but I'm not going to really go forward until we get the Lightalls. But what I will do, he thought, was I'm going to go to the clearing where I know that these two guys, John Burroughs and Jim Penniston, saw the UFO on the first night. So Holt, as part of his investigation of the sighting, kind of thought that he would have a look at the landing site from the first night. And consequently, one of the critical individuals that he took with him, and this is a name that you don't often hear in relation to this sighting, but I think it's one of the most important witnesses to the whole encounter, is Munro Nevels. Now, Munro Nevels was the disaster preparedness officer, and one thing that he had was a Geiger counter to look for radiation leaks. So Holt, when he threw together his team to go out into the forest, he made sure that Munro Nevels was on that team. And when they got to the clearing, Holt was kind of shocked, because I don't know what he'd been expecting to see, but I mentioned that he'd used the phrase debunk this UFO nonsense, put it to rest. He was certainly not expecting to find validation of what had happened to Burroughs and Penniston, but that's exactly what he saw. First thing he noticed when he got to the clearing was that, yeah, exactly as they said, branches have been smashed off the trees. It's like something forced its way in from above, did a kind of controlled landing, and took off again and smashed its way back out. So he was able to validate that. Right in the center of the clearing, exactly where Jim and John said this thing had landed, were 3 indentations. The indentations formed the shape of a triangle. This was December 1980, Eastern England. It was bitterly cold. The ground was pretty hard and frozen. Colonel Holt, when he looked at those marks, and later on, indeed, plaster casts were taken of this thing to try and get a sense of the shape of what it was that was pressing down. But Colonel Holt said, whatever it was, it must have weighed several tons to do this. And so again, the second validation of Burroughs and Penniston's encounter from the first night. The third piece of validation was even more scary. This was basically a small clearing of trees, and obviously, if you can envisage a clearing, you imagine the ring of trees at the edge of the clearing, and half of the trees will be facing the clearing, inward facing, and half will be outward facing. When Munro Nevels looked at this, he noticed a whole bunch of scorch marks, as he put it, where, as he put it, there had been a very high heat source there, and it was like up to a certain level around all these trees, but only on the inward facing bits they were scorched. And one of the things that Holt and his team did, of course, was take a whole bunch of samples of this. The final thing that Colonel Holt did was that he had Munro Nevels run his Geiger counter over the clearing. And he picked up some moderate readings here and there. But when they got to the sides of the trees facing inwards with the scorch marks, there were peak readings. And when they got to the 3 indentations in the ground, the thing kind of, went off the scale. And all the data were written up, and I'm going to go into some of the conclusions a little later. But to pick up this story, Colonel Holt was able to, by this examination of the landing site, validate the story that he'd been told about what had happened to this patrol on the first night. And at that point, Holt himself saw the UFO. Or rather, someone alerted him to the fact and said, hey, look through the trees. And there is an audio tape. Again, it's widely available on the internet. But there's an audio tape. Colonel Holt was a little bit like, do you remember Twin Peaks? Well, he was a little bit like Agent Dale Cooper. It was Holt's custom to carry around with him a little handheld tape recorder to document his observations and thoughts. And so part of this physical examination actually survives in audio film, in audio recording. And there's a point where Holt, basically someone says, hey, look, there's a strange light through the trees. Yeah, I see it too. It's over there. Weird. And at that point, the UFO, which of course Holt had been told it's bag, he himself, far from being able to, quote, debunk this UFO nonsense and put the whole thing to bed, unquote, he ended up as a witness himself. And as a lieutenant colonel on duty, deputy base commander, is one of the highest ranking military officers to have seen and made an official report of a UFO whilst on duty. So they see this UFO. It does not come as close. It doesn't land, not like the first night, but they see it in the sky. At one point, it's moving around erratically. And he said it's as if it was conducting a grid search of some sort. And then at one point, a narrow beam of light fires down from the UFO, which is almost directly overhead, and illuminates a small patch of the ground just feet in front of them. To say that they're stunned is an understatement. And Colonel Holt, speculating about this in later years, has said, was this a weapon? Was this a warning? Was this communication? What was this? And he didn't know. But again, for an officer of his rank to be reporting this sort of thing in a casual manner and saying, yep, this is what happened to myself and other military personnel when I was out there, is little short of extraordinary. So Colonel Holt and his team tried to pursue the UFO. They maneuver their way through the forest out into a farmer's field. They cross a creek. And finally, after a few after really 2 or 3 hours, they look back, and the final observation on Holt's tape recording is, oh no, after all this chase that we've been led, the UFO is right back, directly overhead the Woodbridge base, firing light beams down at it. Subsequently, some personnel at the base have testified that those light beams penetrated one of the most sensitive areas of the base, known as the weapons storage area. Now, I'm not at liberty to comment on what type of weapons may or may not have been stored there, and what interaction might have taken place between the light beam from the UFO and these alleged weapons. But if it helps you to see through this, the guys who worked there nicknamed this place Hot Row and said, yeah, be careful. You'll end up glowing in the dark if you get too close. An interesting and disturbing aspect of this whole case. Just to tell you what happened to some of this evidence, I think a lot of times we tell this sort of story, and the logical question, which sometimes never gets addressed, let alone answered, is, well, what happened next? What did they do after all this? And to cut a long story short, one of the things they did was that they sent the radiation data that Munro Nevels had recorded with the Geiger counter to the Ministry of Defense. And as I mentioned, these are American bases, but on British soil. So the legal and jurisdictional aspects of this case are quite complex. I won't get into NATO Status of Forces Acts, etc., etc. But suffice to say that arguably both America and the UK had jurisdiction, because jurisdiction can be concurrent. In other words, more than one individual or entity can have jurisdiction. But somebody has to have primacy. In other words, someone's going to lead on this, and that perhaps was a little less clear. But for legal reasons, this had to get reported back to the Ministry of Defense. And when the Defense Intelligence staff analyzed the radiation data that had been reported, there was a document, and again, I mentioned an audit trail of documents, the provenance of which is not disputed. One of the key documents about the Rendlesham Forest incident is from the UK government's case file, and the scientific DI-52, which is Defence Intelligence 52, part of DGISTI, which is Director General Scientific and Technical Intelligence. I'm sorry, all governments love this kind of alphabet soup nonsense. But DI-52 produced an assessment, and they said that the levels recorded, quote, seem significantly higher than average background, unquote. And when I rechecked the data years afterwards during a cold case review, I was told that they were about 7.5 times what was expected. Now, you can get into a debate. I mean, I think skeptics commenting on this sometimes question, well, was the piece of equipment appropriate for the job? To which the response is, well, given that we don't have an Acme UFO radiation detector, you can only use the equipment that you've got. So, yeah. And then they get into a debate about, well, were the levels twice as high, 7.5 times as high, whatever. And I say, look, if you get a metal detector and you're searching your yard and it goes bleep, you can get into a debate about whether the needle says 7 or 8 or whatever, but the important thing is that it went bleep. And I think that sometimes, if you'll excuse a foresty pun, we don't see the wood for the trees when it comes to this sort of thing. And the point isn't whether the reading was this or that. The point was that when Munro Nevels, as the experienced disaster preparedness officer, ran his Geiger counter over the clearing, the peak readings came from these 3 indentations where this thing, whatever it was, had pressed itself down into the ground. So that was one important piece of evidence from the Ministry of Defence case file. The other piece of evidence ended up nearly causing a diplomatic row between Britain and the United States. And that's quite interesting for a subject that is supposed to be of no defence interest to anyone. The US government's public position on this, as you know, is that we're not interested in UFOs, don't investigate them anymore, haven't looked at this since 1969 when Blue Book was axed. And yet, there's a rather curious document in the Ministry of Defence case file, and it says this. Shortly after the event, General Gabriel visited the base and took possession of items pertaining to the investigation. These were taken back to his headquarters. Perhaps, and this is a remarkable British understatement, perhaps we might have access to this too. General Gabriel, the obvious question is, well, who was he? General Gabriel was Commander-in-Chief, United States Air Force Europe. He was the senior USAF officer anywhere in Europe. And what did he do after this incident? Given that the US government doesn't investigate UFOs, he got on a plane from his headquarters in Ramstein, Germany, flew to the UK, was briefed on the incident, and took items pertaining to the investigation back to his headquarters and didn't tell us Brits. And boy, were we furious. There is supposed to be, we call it the special relationship. We didn't feel very special. We felt a little bit dumped on. You know, there's, I don't know. The British government is very diplomatic when it comes to this, and there's a kind of unwritten rule: don't upset the Americans. Interestingly enough, one of the other documents, just going back to Project Condign, and the more general release of the UFO files, is that at least we got our own bag. We managed to upset the Americans big time over the UFO issue back in around about 1993. This was long after the dust had settled on Rendlesham, of course, and General Gabriel. But we had a case involving a huge, silent, black, triangular UFO seen by lots of police and military witnesses as well as the public over large parts of the UK. And we were not able to explain this, and we asked the Americans, do you think that this might be some sort of secret prototype, hypersonic spy plane or drone that you've inadvertently forgotten to tell us about and are flying over the UK just accidentally having forgotten to seek the proper diplomatic flight clearance? And they said, no, we haven't. We haven't got any such aircraft. Well, then, a British government document emerged saying, well, I wonder, and maybe some of these UFOs are spy planes. And there was a particular controversy about an aircraft codenamed Aurora, which may or may not have existed. And again, some fairly junior officer thought, well, you know what, the Americans told us this, but maybe we'll ask one last time. And so the British government asked the American government, are you sure that you don't have something like this? And through the embassy, a note came back that said the US Secretary of Defense was incandescent with rage at the implication that he had misled Congress on this. And when we tell you we do not have a secret prototype spy plane that we're flying over the UK, that's exactly what we mean. So again, this whole debate about UFOs and the wider debate about whether some sightings might be classified black project aircraft or drones managed to cause this near diplomatic row. One of the interesting things as a postscript to that story is that somebody in the American government actually asked us, oh, no, we don't have anything like that. But by the way, do you Brits have any large triangular-shaped UFO that you might be, flying around? What's particularly interesting about that, of course, is that the US government no longer investigates UFOs. So why was the question asked? Going back to Rendlesham Forest, I'd mentioned the Defence Intelligence Staff assessment of the radiation levels. I'd mentioned that General Gabriel had been briefed on this and taken items back to his headquarters in Ramstein, Germany. That's where the trail goes cold. So asking the question, yes, but what happened next? We can't at the moment take the story any further. General Gabriel died several years ago. The wing commander, the commanding officer of the twin bases, General Gordon Williams, does not recollect this second visit, even though it's recorded quite clearly in the documents that it took place. So the trail, it seems, has gone cold. But for anyone who thinks that governments don't take this subject seriously, oh yes, they do. And obviously, as I mentioned, all the things like the soil samples, the samples from the sides of the trees that were facing inwards, all this stuff was put in test tubes. That material's gone somewhere. It hasn't disappeared off the face of the earth. Well, maybe it has, but someone knows. And that itself raises an interesting question with Rendlesham Forest, with some of these more highly classified studies more generally. And one of the things that I think it says in the introduction to this talk is that I might address the question of who currently has lead responsibility for this subject. Because it's easy to say, oh, it must be someone in the government. It must be NSA, CIA. But what if the answer was actually very different? What if it actually turned out that the government was telling the truth on this? I know that's not popular in some quarters, but let me take a step back and tell you one interesting fact about the Ministry of Defence's classified study into remote viewing and the Project Condign intelligence study into the UFO phenomenon. Both of these studies were sponsored by the Defense Intelligence Staff, an ultra-secretive part of the MOD. But the studies weren't actually carried out by them at all. They were carried out by a defense contractor. In other words, the government had moved these ultra-sensitive studies out into the private sector. Why would they do this, you might ask? One possible explanation is that moving something to the private sector takes something further away from the scope of congressional and parliamentary scrutiny. It generally takes it outside of the scope of the Freedom of Information Act. And it's an interesting fact that some of the most highly classified and sensitive studies, as in politically embarrassing, are actually done not in government at all, but by the private sector. Now, there is a point at which you can say that parts of the private sector are indistinguishable from the military and the government itself. And you hear this phrase, the military-industrial complex, for example. And it's certainly an undeniable fact that many senior military personnel, after their retirement, segue neatly from, say, a position as one of the service chiefs to having a seat on the board of some of the big defense contractors, some of the big aerospace companies, some of the big weapons firms. So, and some of these people in the private sector have security clearances which are higher than most of us in government ever had. So when people ask the question, who's doing this these days? Who, if there's a secret, who's custodian of this secret? If there is an investigative program post Project Blue Book, who's doing it? Don't be surprised if the answer is, it's actually in the private sector. And I think that's a point that often gets overlooked. But just finishing off the Rendlesham Forest story, it was, as I say, this perfect storm of a case, and also this provable kind of deconstruction of the official line on this. If the official line is that UFOs are of no interest, why on earth would the senior USAF general in Europe personally fly in to be briefed on this and take material away? So there's no doubt in my mind that the Rendlesham Forest incident is a hugely significant case, and this is one of the reasons why about 2 or 3 years ago John Burroughs and Jim Penniston approached me, and they'd spoken previously about doing a book, and they had teamed up, I know, with Linda Moulton Howe, for example, who knows a huge amount about this case and is one of the real champions over the years of flying the flag for this case and doing so much to bring it out of the shadows and into the public domain with the work she's done. For a number of reasons, that project didn't come to fruition, and Jim and John came to me and said they were considering self-publishing a book. Could I contribute a chapter? So I wrote a chapter, and I wrote about, by the time I stopped writing, I realized I'd done 10,000 words. And I thought, well, this was supposed to be a short chapter about the MOD's involvement with this case and my own cold case review of this. When I was on the MOD's UFO project, 91 to 94, obviously Rendlesham Forest was in the past, but it was soon apparent to me that this was easily the most significant case in our files, and it was also a case on which I got regular media and public and indeed parliamentary inquiries, all of which had to be dealt with. So it was clear to me that I needed to revisit this, and accordingly I did a cold case review. For example, revisiting the radiation data, rechecking whether or not this thing had been tracked on radar, which apparently briefly it had been. And I fired off 10,000 words back to Jim and John, and I thought, gosh, I was only supposed to be doing a little chapter. I thought, I think there's a whole book here, and maybe we should team up on it as opposed to my just writing a chapter. And I was in the very fortunate position of having had a number of books, because of my government background, published by major mainstream publishers. And I said to Jim and John, would you like to consider co-writing a book on this? And they agreed, and apparently the end product is sitting on a table downstairs. I haven't seen it yet. But it's an unusual book, I think, for a number of reasons. it's a kind of insider looking out perspective on this, given that Jim and John are ex-military and I'm ex-government, and they were direct witnesses. So it tells the wider story of the Rendlesham Forest incident, but it does it primarily through John and Jim's eyes. And one of the things that was quite unusual about this is that, to the best of my knowledge, it is the only UFO book that has ever needed security clearance from both the British and the American government. And also, in parallel with that, the publishers decided to give it a legal read with a specialist attorney. So, for all sorts of reasons, it was an extremely difficult book to write, steering a little bit of a delicate course between things that we can say, for example, some of the material about Project Condign, and things that we can't say, for example, about Hot Row. One of the key reasons that we decided to write this book was that, without breaching too many confidentialities, both Jim, but particularly John, have had and continue to have some extremely serious ongoing health issues. And in order to address those issues, they need a proper diagnosis, and they need access to their military medical records. They can't get them. Now, this is extremely unusual, and it transpires, and we have official confirmation of this, that their medical records, their military medical records, from, because their view, of course, seemingly backed up by what it says in the British intelligence study, Project Condign, their view is that their health problems may have arisen from being irradiated by this thing. They were the guys who got closest to it. Jim touched it. John was seen, the phrase that has been used, he went into the light. Even he doesn't really know what that means, but clearly he's extremely concerned and wants his military medical records. It turns out that they are lodged in a little-known, classified section of the Veterans Affairs Agency. And one of the reasons we actually have confirmation of this was that last year we did, as did some of the other speakers here, Linda and Travis, for example, we spoke at an event called the Citizens Hearing on Disclosure in Washington, D.C. And the Citizens Hearing on Disclosure was the brainchild of Steve Bassett, who's somewhat of an activist in this particular subject. And Steve's view was, and is, if Congress won't do its job, we the people will. So he put on a series of congressional hearings on the UFO phenomenon, done as if Congress was doing it for real. Congress has looked at this on 2 previous occasions, but not since the late 60s. Steve could not get any serving Congress people to do it, but he managed to recruit a panel of no longer serving Congress people from some Republicans, some Democrats, some Libertarians. So right across the political spectrum. And basically, I mean, this was pretty scary stuff. I mean, I was one of the people who testified, and it really was like the real thing. And I've occasionally sat and watched one of my senior officers being grilled in the UK by the House of Commons Defence Committee. This was very similar, only I was up there in the spotlight, and it was like, yes, ma'am, yes, sir. Answer the question. Don't go on and extrapolate. Just, thank you, sir, thank you. Moving on. So that was a pretty interesting and scary experience. But one of the one of the key themes that emerged from that was that these former congressional representatives, hearing John and Jim's story about, firstly, the encounter, but secondly, this inability to get access to their own medical records, even a redacted version, it so outraged these former congressional representatives that they got together and they drafted a letter to the Secretary of the Veterans Administration and to the President of the United States, asking and indeed demanding, in the interests of Jim and John's health, that these medical records be unlocked. This is an ongoing process. There is talk of a federal lawsuit, though I know that there are legal factors that may place limits on that. I think the military service, and I think it's the Ferres Doctrine, does put some obstacles in their way. But clearly, there is an imperative, an absolute imperative. And one of the Congress people's staffers was able to confirm, yeah, this is the classified records section. It's as if these people were special forces, and yet they were never special forces. So something about the Rendlesham Forest incident has caused government, not just at the time, but even now, over 30 years on, to treat this as if it was one of the most highly classified and sensitive areas in government. Again, I speculated a little bit as to why that is. I think I've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm just going to make some concluding points and then round off. But one or two. Pardon me? Yeah, I'll make a couple of concluding remarks and then I'll take some questions. So perhaps a couple of final stories. I'll go back now to the release of the files. And there was a kind of amusing postscript, one about files more generally, and one which is relevant to Rendlesham Forest. The one that was Rendlesham relevant was that in all these 55,000 pages of documents that were declassified and released, sometimes one or two things went missing. And when looking at defense intelligence staff files, dating back decades on this phenomenon, one little time period was missing. And that was December 1980, when the Rendlesham Forest incident took place. The files before then had survived. The files after them had survived. The file that might have had some extra documents about Rendlesham to the ones that have survived in the divisional files where I worked, it turns out were destroyed. Now, one of the questions that was then obviously asked is, who authorized the destruction of these files and on what basis? Good questions. Unfortunately, not questions that we're able to answer, because the destruction slips, which would have recorded these pieces of information, had themselves been destroyed. So they destroyed the files, and then they destroyed the destruction slips explaining why the files had been destroyed. You couldn't make this up. Perhaps one of, I think, the most disturbing and yet amusing things, just highlighting the... I think from this presentation you've probably, I hope, got the impression that government, certainly the British government, has had an uneasy relationship with this subject over the years. We've done it. We've found a lot of interesting stuff, arguably not a smoking gun, but enough to make us come up with the sorts of phrases that I've quoted from Project Condign. And yet there's this central unease. No government, no military likes to say, we don't know. So the implication that there might be something in your airspace, better, stronger, faster, is not a comfortable place for governments to go. One other final postscript to the release of the files was that one case that I think a lot of people were particularly interested in seeing was in 1997. Apparently there had been a case involving a big Navy exercise involving NATO, so probably lots of different nationalities. Certainly we knew that a British warship, HMS Manchester, had been involved, and indeed a former chief of the defence staff, Lord Hill Norton, took a strong interest in this, and indeed a strong interest in the UFO phenomenon more generally. Imagine, when I say he's a former chief of the defence staff, that's a 5-star military officer who was the UK's most senior. It's kind of like saying that a former chair of the Joint Chiefs went on to be interested in UFOs. So Lord Hill Norton asked the Secretary of State for Defence, I am taking a close personal interest in this case involving HMS Manchester. I'd like to see the ship's logs for the time in question. He was told, we've checked the logs just before the event. There's nothing there. We've checked the logs just after the event. There's nothing there either. Unfortunately, the logs for the period, the ship's log for the period that you're actually after was blown overboard by a freak gust of wind. Well, to cut a long story short, Lord Hill Norton was not amused, and quite rightly so. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to wrap it up now, but thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.